Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this week's Tips and Tricks webinar. Today's topic is on zero touch. Please use the Please use the Q&A chat if you have any questions during the webinar. With that, we'll get started. Our presenter today is a regional architect, Thomas Poole. Thomas, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Really appreciate it. So again, today's topic, zero trust security, simplify the impossible. I think it's very important. I've got a long, pretty rich history with zero trust and working with customers in workshops and helping them understand what zero trust means and going through that. I think it's very important to understand what zero trust is. And I've got a couple things towards the very end that help us understand a posture going forward. And I think that's slightly different than what we've seen. So it's not just product-based. We're aligning with processes both for governance and for how we utilize governance and implement that, and also measure ourselves against other customers, right? So moving forward, I think it's important to look back at to what things used to be and the why, right? So before we had a fortress, I remember working with Novell networks, right? And everything was at the center. People walked into a building. So what we worried about was the perimeter, right? You used your key card when key cards were available, or a lock. You walked in and you were given a badge and you sat and did your work all day. At the very beginning, it was behind a green screen, right? You worked from a server on a dumb terminal. Eventually PCs came in. Part of what I'm trying to mention is that the product and how you were delivered information and you worked with data has changed given the products that you use, but what you do hasn't really changed, right? There's cloud available, there's other things, but the way it used to be, there's a building, there's people that went into a building, and what you really worried about was north-south. In other words, what's coming in the outside of my perimeter or the outside zone. And then you worried about making sure users had their password in place, right? Making sure that it was complex enough every 30 days. You didn't worry about a cloud. There wasn't a SaaS. And so what you had was a fortress. And everything behind the fortress was protected. And CIOs or CISOs slept pretty good, right? All you worried about was behind your wall, and you could keep an eye on the wall. You could put people at the edge. And things have really changed, right? So it's considered safe. So where is the perimeter now? The perimeter is wherever it needs to be, right? So our lives have really changed. And Forrester recognized this. So talking about today, right? Think of all the personal things that you use that have nothing to do with work, but you may use it on your work devices. You may have work on your personal devices. Another important item is, as I move over to here, a lot of the IoT, and forget the word IoT. Are there cameras in the building that might talk out and get updates, right? Are they pushing analytics? Are they leaking data? Can they be compromised? This wasn't a fear 10 up to 30 years ago. And Forrester recognized this, and it's very important. What can I trust? Well, right now, you really can't trust anything that you can't control, and controlling that can be a challenge. It's one of the reasons that Checkpoint's product suite has expanded, not just into being able to analyze the network. We have the Harmony and a lot of other things. And we try to now align that specifically with what Forrester came out with. So expanding further, Forrester about 10 years ago, and I'm going to talk more about them and provide more data shortly. Forrester came out about 10 years ago and said, listen, we know things are evolving. We see this internet thing, right? This was slightly before a lot of the SD-WAN stuff, but they knew that data was going to be getting pushed out further, pushed away from the fortress. And they needed a way to be able to classify where the challenges were and understand the risks. So they came out with zero trust. And interestingly enough, something 10 years ago that was put together is still valid today. And the reason is because it wasn't very specific. If you try to go in with zero trust by yourself, it can be a challenge because they wanted to wrap rings around specific items, right? So why was this done? Well, looking at today, moving forward to today now, right? Breaches involve stolen or weak credentials. Why? Because changing your password every 30 days doesn't work anymore when you've got dozens to hundreds of things that you're logging into. You need to be able to centralize that. But a lot of businesses, a lot of companies haven't been able to easily do that, or there are weak processes in place to control that. In other words, if someone's trying a password over and over and 1,000th time they're able to guess it, that's a weak issue. And that involves what would be a compromised device, whether it is a mobile phone that has access to the inside of the network or something within the Office 365 cloud or Google. If it's compromised, that's just used as a way to get further and deeper within the network. And another challenge that was found was if breaches occurred, and I ask customers this a lot when I sit in on workshops with them and help them understand their security posture and go through a lot of the governance that's in place. A lot of companies have not invested in the ability to understand what's happening. What does that mean? Taking every log from everywhere, being able to classify and act on those logs. And that's really and truly important, because knowing something's happened. One of the questions I ask is, how do you know something's occurred within your network? And the challenge is, if the specific controls are not in place, it's impossible, right? Moving forward. So never trust, always verify. You can't trust the people. You can't trust anything that's in place, and you must continuously monitor that, right? And there's a couple things from Forbes and things that we've seen the headlines. There was one again this morning, right? Compromised issues with Meraki, right? Affecting the ability to get Office 365. That just happened just a few hours ago, right? So what's interesting is I love the way Forrester did this. It was a bit of a challenge, but what they said was, let's lump things together and then basically build homes with how you would protect each of these, right? So moving forward, there's 7 total pillars that they put in place. And what I'll first do is align what we've had, right? Workloads. What's interesting is workloads have changed. 10 years ago, it was everything within your private cloud. AWS was just starting, Azure, none of the other stuff was really in place. So anything that was API based or server based or your original VMware, that was a workload, but it sat behind in your fortress, right? But they knew things were going to shift. They saw what was occurring. So moving that out to the cloud, but it's still effective now. The workloads are just in a different place. And I'll go into that in a moment. I saw the original devices, right? It's hard to believe, but I think 2007 was when I got my first mobile phone that couldn't do a lot. But after a few years, which hasn't been that long, they were able to connect in. Finally, we got HTML markup working properly on devices, right? Data. In other words, the data that sits on your device, if you have a endpoint or laptop that's lost, is it just a brick that happens to be sitting in a cab or stolen from a bar or stolen from your bag, right? Or could it be compromised? Is it encrypted? Is it safe? That's the difference between a $600 or $1,000 laptop and $1 million. If you're someone high up in HR or someone that does development, very important. The people, and we started to see some of this very recently with identifying users on AD that happen to go to the internet. A lot of my customers are doing that now, or not enforcing rules, but utilizing logs to determine, at least being able to go back and see when a user did something, using AD controls and networks. We'll get further into that, but I want to call that the traditional. It's not just north-south or what's coming in and out of the perimeter, but also east-west, right? Micro-segmentation, that's key, because everything's on a domain now. Everything you share authentication. And if you are able to get on a device inside of the network, right, whether it's on the private cloud or in another location sitting on the same WAN, often my customers are using, hey, if I'm sitting on a trusted, so-called trusted network, allow that person or device to get anywhere. And that's the challenge. That shouldn't necessarily be done because you're assuming that the desktop has proper controls, right? So let me touch on some of the different things that we have, and then I want to spend a bit more time on what Forrester says and how you can measure your own zero trust security and how to go forward with that, right? So again, with our portfolio, I'll touch on these. I think it's important because Gil, even up to 3, even longer, but especially in the last 3 years, our CEO, Gil Schwed, has started to align and I think it's very important, and that's the reason our portfolio is much larger, to align products with being able to protect along each of these specific zones, right? So we started with what? If you remember, the ability to protect in a private cloud. It was expanded to SaaS and IaaS and all that. Now it's just CloudGuard, right? And we've got Quantum and we've got Spark. But touching on each of these, we have a pretty complete and thorough footprint on each of the pillars. So devices, people with authentication and being able to support that, data, networks, workloads, and really important, and as we expand our MDR, NDR, and others, taking, if you happen to be using cloud or pushing things to our cloud, taking all of your events, if you don't have a mature model internal to your network, and being able to react and have us react for you by using MDR, right? So again, supporting all zero trust principles is key to our portfolio and has been for a while. So talking about networks, I think it's important. I'm not going to go over everything here because I know we're time controlled. I think it's important to talk about the things that are a challenge for us as of today, right? 2022. And what we're seeing as challenges is being able to have granular policy across all environments, right? With the same smart one, we all know we can have different layers in our security and of course a different cloud posture, but still use the same objects. If you are wanting to protect ACI, which I'll talk about in a minute, across a different area, or NSXT, we have the ability to connect into ACI and NSXT, and either through PBR or other controls, be able to understand what's happening through microsegmentation controls, right? Across the LAN, always we've been able to do north-south protections, but expanding that and making it faster and having more thorough application control. And where we're seeing the challenges often, especially in the medical fields, right? I've done a lot of workshops for hospitals and recommended controls to them, and they don't understand, or often do understand, but can't control because of the administration or what I call governance, IoT, right? I don't know if you're aware, but most hospitals and GE and some of the other providers don't go and patch their MRI machines. They may have updates that are minimal, but if they do things that go beyond a specific control area, it has to get FDA recertified. So again, governance, what do? They buy a new one and may ship that one to another hospital at a cheaper price that's not as compliant, and they can get away with it. But that's one small example. You know, camera controls, things that have firmware that can't be patched are a big problem. And being able to protect that's key. Workloads is key as well. Again, you've probably heard of a lot of different CloudGuard protections. There's a lot of pink when it comes to us being able to protect across the board. But I think it's important to understand VMs, functions, and containers, right? Whether it's native cloud, whether it's ACI, Cisco, across a private cloud, or extended into the public cloud, or Google controls AWS. Every day I work with different customers that are at different maturity levels. Whether they're doing what we call a secure cloud transformation, or they are working with a hybrid environment where some stuff sits on-prem because of comfort levels or otherwise, and may use multiple tiers. But we can protect along that and secure and enforce zero trust. Again, people, identity awareness is the key, and it's one of our most complex products, right? And I work with a lot of customers that want two different things, right? One is, I want to be able to use identity awareness, but I just want logs to be able to go into my firewall. That way, if there's an issue, I can go back and see the who and what. In other words, the machine and the person, right? But being able to enforce single sign-on with AD for specific rules across specific environments, MFA, and then being able to take that context and align it with anomaly detection using AI. Again, geo, time, locations is key to being able to trust and verify. It's the difference between authentication and authorization, right? Okay, and then zero trust devices. This is very important. And one of the biggest challenges that working with my customers, right, is endpoints that don't have proper protections or mobile, right? There's a lot of companies out there that may not use MDM controls, so they don't know if there's malware on devices that you've allowed to corporate networks, either through VPN Or maybe you haven't allowed it, but your VPN posture allows for people to work from home on their PC. It's not that hard to throw it on the iPad, right? It may be jailbroken. There may be issues with FDE, right? There could be malware. That's what people are attacking now, is mobile devices and endpoints. One of the best ways to do that, right, from a device standpoint, and what I'm seeing quite often is my customers not utilizing proper controls on USB, right? Well, they'll say, listen, I scan everything when they put it on the USB, I scan it, but you don't protect it, you don't encrypt. You could have data loss. And that's the challenge. And then quite often it's most users are forced to use it. Those that are really important, right? The VIPs, the ones that would really have sensitive data, they're allowed to do it. And sorry, I have a golden doodle and he likes to talk sometimes. So zero trust data, again, moving along, it's important to make sure the data is both encrypted and if you lose that endpoint, if you lose that workstation, that it's a brick, right? Whether through FDE that we support or other BitLocker, it's key to make sure that's both centrally managed, Windows Enterprise, and being able to make sure that you are compliant, right? If you're doing credit card controls, you either need to outsource that to make sure you're not keeping them on premise. But if you do, or deal with PII or healthcare, you're going to have that encrypted in data. And depending on your environment, whether it's production, you're going to have to segment production from UAT, right? From development, from QA, because production may have social security numbers and otherwise, and information related to health or information that needs to be segmented and secured as per your agreements, or you're going to fail SOC 2, right? You're going to fail HIPAA requirements. Again, moving along, because I got a bit of other material, visibility and analytics. Again, data is nothing if you can't understand your current posture. And a lot of my customers are comfortable, and we'll talk about the maturity model in just a moment, right? They're comfortable with, I got the firewall logs, I know who's on the VPN. It's really more than that. You need to know that Sally tried to log in 38 times in the past 2 minutes or 32 minutes, right? And be able to action on that. And that's the difference. It's not just individual blade information. You're down to the container, down to the user level, track trends, and act on events that occur. That means you're using something that gives you the ability at both the cloud, if you have that, and the premise level to understand what that is, because a user is not going to be able to do that. So automation and orchestration. This is the highest security model that I see with customers. In other words, if you almost want to call a firewall as a service, right? It's where you're not logging into firewalls. There's a change management request that comes in, right? Or an incident response. Through the ticketing system, you might have a script. You might have something automated that's done that goes through the approval levels that takes the human challenge out of it, right? So we go through the automation. We automatically update the rules, and we have delegation of admins where needed, right? And a lot of my customers that are automating security changes are using Chef, Puppet, Terraform, a lot of other products to automate. A lot of this in healthcare, a lot of this in manufacturing, where human element can kill people, right? Again, and what's important as well, and not just for Checkpoint, it's working with all the vendors, is being able to integrate across any of the different landscapes that I mentioned with enforcement and management, and being able to communicate. We have APIs with all of our products, and our already one footprint has multiplied multifold, right? With being able to action on our gateways using a secure method without having to go and push policy, right? So again, what I talked about was simplify. I think it's very important to understand a couple of different things, right? Assess and analyze. If you look at the Forrester material as it sits, they make statements, right? And it's very important because a lot of vendors, including Checkpoint, have taken those statements and wrapped products and processes around those to make sure that our customers are secure, right? But it's also a challenge because before any of that can happen, quite often, there needs to be governance in place. In other words, a CISO has to have both the ability to make decisions and make calls, right? And have the power to align a security model and enforce it. In other words, he needs to be, she needs to be, or needs to be cohabitating within the network teams, within the security change teams, and endpoint teams, anywhere else with the products that we talked about, to make sure that the specific governance is enforced. How do we do that? So our team, I work with several other architects, and we go out for our customers and do workshops. I'll send some separate collateral outside of the call here. We're running short on time, but we'll do workshops with customers. It can be one day, it can be 4 hours. We also have a more minimal workshop where we go over basically change controls, management, etc., and work with your account manager if you want more information on this. And I'll be happy to provide account managers and work with customers. But what we do is we go through NIST controls. We go through zero trust, and we help customers understand their posture in each of these areas. And remember, one thing that I try not to forget is not everyone's completely checkpoint. And I think it's very important. Zero trust is meant to understand what devices and products and processes are in place to enforce zero trust controls, right? It's not always going to be a checkpoint. And our reports are done in such a way that helps the customer understand where they are at a maturity level. In other words, you could have a perfect product in place that's misconfigured. So aligning a security infrastructure with a zero trust approach is important, right? Number two, after you understand your posture, see what others are doing, right? And then number three, what t-shirt size fits you? And this is kind of funny because it moves into the alignment that I talked about before. So I'm going to rush here because I want to make sure we have time for any questions and others. It's important to understand. So I worked with Forrester a couple months ago to help understand what's been happening with zero trust. Well, what really pushed zero trust? Everyone not being able to get to the office right when as the pandemic occurred, and even up to now in many cases where we're starting to migrate back. ZTNA, how do I get access? So the first thing was getting people on board, not necessarily securely, right? And then zero trust, SASE edge, and then eventual microsegmentation. Okay, everybody's now talking in. I can't see everything they're doing unless I have protections at the host level or understand what's happening on a host. All I can see is network-based stuff. And firewalls aren't very good at just looking at MBT traffic as it sits, or CIFS, right? So for Forrester, it's very important. I asked the analyst that I was working with, right, over the last 30 days, can you just do a dump of what the requests are? That, like, what are you working on? And obviously they're going to have more zero trust because, well, they came up with it, right? So more important is which of the following strategic approaches are you looking at over the next 12 months? That was starting second quarter of this year. I think it's important because a lot of the things that customers have found after looking at this is I'm not mature enough. I need to put together a framework first. And there's NIST frameworks, right? There's TOGAF, there's a lot of other frameworks that can be utilized. And that's what we do in the workshops as architects for our customers, is help them align the technology with the governance and put together a plan for zero trust, right? Security strategies. In other words, I want to get to the cloud, or I'm halfway there, or I want to secure cloud transformation. What do I do? And some others. I'll forward this later, but I think it's very important. A lot of it's aligned with, I need to do stuff. How do I do it securely, right? So this is an interesting, item. I don't like the top down, but okay. Which of the following initiatives or IT security priorities over the next 12 months are important? Okay. Improving security capabilities and services. In other words, take what I have that's in place now. I don't think I did it necessarily securely. We need to secure it, two-factor, whatever else, right? So I'll quickly run through these. I think it's important to understand Forrester has decided, hey, we're not changing zero trust. It's pretty finite, and I'll say it's very hard or nearly impossible. But they came out with something called t-shirt sizes, and I think it's pretty cool. So I've had difficulty in the past telling a customer, how bad is it? Or what are we looking like? How do I compare to other customers? I could just look at the ones that I've had. So what they've done was they've come out and are publishing this as well, with something called t-shirt sizes, slim, medium, and extra large. I don't know about the t-shirt size and the why, but if you want to call it small, medium, and large, in other words, the size of the t-shirt means the model or approach methodology with how far or mature you are with implementing zero trust, right? So quickly running through, right? Identity provider, AD and on-prem. That's not going to work for a highly mature customer that needs the internet to make billions of dollars a year, right? But it works for someone that has an AD server on site, and you might do ADFS, right? So there's slight maturity, right? Thinking about privilege management. In other words, we're doing authentication, not authorization. Rudimentary management. Minimal segmentation. Obviously on firewalls, we're just looking at north-south. So I think it's pretty awesome because it tells other customers that fit within what they consider to be slim or the beginning category, right? Moving ahead to medium, right? Pretty cool. Cloud IDP, meaning that there's some sort of identity provider. Everyone has to do MFA. That's really the baseline. You've got to do that in today's times, right? Joiner, leaver, role provisioning. In other words, there's an automated process, but not a continuous one for every new employee that gets on or off board. It's not aligned with HR completely, right? You can manage remote devices, right? And just some encryption. Maybe we figured out where we need to be compliant, maybe not. The biggest challenge is, hey, we got all of our logs, but we're not doing anything with them, right? We might have some dashboards that show the biggest internet users, right? Basic DLP. DLP is key because being able to enforce it at the cloud and at every point to where you are is key, right? Because that's where data loss occurs. And then the most mature, if you want to call it zero trust XL, that's what Forrester calls it. And it's very important because you have highly mature areas across the board, but think of the money and time spent with being able to support this. It's a challenge and nobody starts off here. So if you think of a stepped approach, this is really where you get to SSO, on each of these. So if you take a look, I've actually run together a specific board with being able to see what we look like with a slim, medium, and large, and how they compare to each other, right? And this is from Forrester, and I think it's very important that the people that came out with the approach methodology to security, which is you can't trust anything and you shouldn't be, at least being able to help customers classify that, right? So it's very key to being able to understand. And this is the approach we use with customers now. We still give reports and many of them look like fails, but a lot of them have low-hanging fruit, right? You can do small things to make security bigger. So we deal with the low-hanging fruit first and then help customers with governance. Because if you don't have a policy in place that gets signed off on with security training, how can you enforce it, right? So I'll hand back to you. I really appreciate the time and I hope this gave value, but I'll hand back to you, Rob, and thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Yeah, we had some questions came up. As you were going through, you ended up answering a couple of things, so I won't go through those in interest of time. Had one about basically, this is great for everything that's identified, but you don't know what you don't know. What about shadow IT or a rogue employee, or not necessarily rogue, but somebody did something incorrectly, not knowing? I mean, how do I identify those things in this model?
Yeah, that could be a big challenge because that assumes that there's a slightly more mature model in place. Shadow IT, rogue employees, assumes that there's controls at the either desktop or mobile level that can control that. And that can be a real challenge. So what we do is when we do the stepped approach for the workshops, and I think I could use the workshop best because I've worked with customers a number of times, is identify key areas. And it's one of our areas out of our NIST controls that we specifically identify where rogue employees, but it's done on a product level, right? We don't look at the employee itself. We look at how the users get authenticated, validated, and then a lot of it goes back to logging and behavior and risk management at the endpoint and mobile level.
Great. Yeah, I think that covers it. Like I said, you went through a lot of them. I did want to.
I'm glad I answered them.
What's that?
I'm glad I answered some
yeah,
of them.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, you did a good job.
Thanks.
I just want to say again about the workshops that he mentioned there. I mean, I know this was on Zero Trust, but these workshops cover everything security, but you know, you got to start with the plan, right, Thomas? You have to realize what you have, what tools you have in place, and how to best utilize them. And that's where the workshop can really help you develop that security plan moving forward. Because this
Correct.
is something that's never finished. It needs care and feeding.
Yes, it does, continuous. And we've done Zero Trust only workshops where we don't get specifically into architecture. And again, work with your account manager. We can at least discuss. There's not a charge for these. What we want to do is help with posture. And if there's some products that are needed to support it, that's great. But it's helping with posture and approach methodology to Zero Trust.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And Thomas is one of the architects that does this. We have plenty of other architects around and resources to help. So, like you said, contact me, him, or your account team if that's something that interests you. With that, we're at the bottom of the hour here. Thank you, Thomas. Great information.
Yep.
We'll send that follow-up email with any referenced content and the recording link for this session. Next webinar will be in 2 weeks. You'll see the invitation for that soon. But with that, I'll let you go. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and enjoy your day. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, team. See ya.
See ya.